December 17, 1944, 09 to 15 hours. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium, Obergefreiter Klaus Zimmermann pressed himself against the frozen earth as the sound reached his ears, not the sharp crack of rifle fire that had become as familiar to him as his own breathing after 3 years of combat, not the staccato burst of an MG-42 that German soldiers knew meant their own weapon was firing. Something deeper, something that made his stomach clench with a fear he'd learned to recognize on the Eastern Front and in Normandy. The distinctive, thunderous hammering of an American .50 caliber machine gun. The sound was coming from the tree line 400 meters to his left. Zimmermann's company, part of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, had been advancing through the Ardennes Forest as part of Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's massive counteroffensive that would later be known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. They'd been making good progress since the offensive began. 3 days earlier, on December 16th, American forces were scattered across a wide front caught by surprise, disorganized by the sudden German assault. The fog and overcast weather had grounded Allied aircraft, removing the threat that had dominated every German movement since the Normandy landings 6 months earlier. For the first time since June, German forces were advancing, pushing the Americans back, retaking ground. Then the .50 opened fire. Zimmermann watched as Unteroffizier Hans Weber, who had been moving tactically between 2 trees 50 meters ahead of Zimmermann's position, simply came apart. There was no other way to describe what happened. One moment Weber was there, a veteran soldier with 4 years of combat experience, moving from cover to cover the way 1,000 repetitions had taught him. The next moment, the massive half-inch projectile struck him center mass, and he ceased to exist as a recognizable human form. The M2 Browning's rounds didn't wound soldiers. They didn't incapacitate them. They obliterated them. They destroyed them so completely that what remained bore little resemblance to a human being. Weber had survived the Eastern Front. He'd survived Kursk in July 1943, where German armor had broken itself against Soviet defenses. He'd survived the retreat from Ukraine. He'd survived Normandy, where the Atlantic Wall had collapsed in days despite years of fortification. He'd survived 3 days of the Ardennes offensive, moving through artillery fire and small arms fire with the veterans' developed ability to sense danger and avoid it. And then, in less than a second, in the time it takes to draw a single breath, he was dead, not wounded and calling for a medic, not bleeding and capable of being saved if someone could reach him with medical supplies. Simply dead. The .50 caliber rounds had hit him center mass, and the energy transfer was so extreme that his body had been literally torn apart by forces that exceeded what human tissue and bone could withstand. This wasn't Zimmermann's first encounter with American heavy machine guns. He'd faced them in Normandy during the fighting after D-Day, when German forces had tried desperately to contain the Allied beachhead. He'd seen what they did to the SDKF Z-222 armored cars in his unit's reconnaissance section. Those light armored vehicles, fast and maneuverable, useful for scouting and screening operations, became death traps when they encountered American positions defended by M2s. The thin armor that would stop rifle rounds and shell fragments was like tissue paper to .50 caliber fire. He'd watched 3 armored cars destroyed in a single engagement, penetrated at ranges where the German crews couldn't effectively return fire. The vehicles left burning by the road. He'd seen what .50s did to buildings during the fighting in Caen. His squad had taken cover in a substantial stone house, walls thick enough to stop rifle fire easily. The Americans had brought up a Sherman tank with its turret-mounted M2 and systematically destroyed their position. The .50 caliber rounds punched through the exterior stone wall, traveled through the entire structure, and exited through the wall on the opposite side. The interior walls, the furniture, everything in the path of the rounds was destroyed. 2 men in Zimmermann's squad had been killed by rounds that had already passed through 2 walls. The energy remaining after penetrating 20 inches of stone and brick was still sufficient to kill, but understanding the mathematical reality of what the M2 Browning could do and experiencing it were 2 different things. The calculations told you that a 700-grain projectile traveling at 2,800 feet per second delivered approximately 14,000 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle. that this energy was roughly 4 times what a rifle bullet delivered, that the temporary wound cavity created by such a projectile striking human tissue would be catastrophic. But seeing it happen to someone you knew, someone who had shared his rations with you that morning, that made the mathematics real in a way that numbers on paper never could. Let me tell you about why German soldiers feared the M2 Browning more than almost any other weapon in the American arsenal. Not because it was the most deadly weapon statistically. Artillery killed far more soldiers overall. Not because it killed the most German soldiers in absolute numbers. That distinction belonged to rifles and hand grenades simply through the sheer numbers of weapons in use. But because of what the M2 represented and what it did when it hit you. Because of the mathematical and physical certainty that if you were exposed to 50 caliber fire, your chances of survival approached 0. Not metaphorically 0, not very low chances, mathematically 0. The physics of energy transfer didn't allow for survival. The story of why the M2 became the most feared American weapon begins not in World War II, but in World War I. And it begins with a recognition that warfare was changing in ways that existing weapons couldn't address. The battlefields of 1917 were introducing threats that the weapons of 1914 had never been designed to counter. In 1917, the nature of combat was transforming rapidly. Machine guns had proven their value in the trenches. The lessons of the Somme in 1916, where British forces had taken 60,000 casualties on the first day of the offensive, many of them to German machine gun fire, had demonstrated beyond any doubt that machine guns were the dominant weapon of defensive warfare. A few machine gunners in a well-positioned emplacement could stop battalion-sized attacks, could inflict casualties at rates that made offensive operations prohibitively expensive in terms of men lost. The machine gun had fundamentally changed warfare in ways that military thinkers were still trying to understand and adapt to. But these machine guns, devastating as they were against infantry, were firing rifle-caliber ammunition. The German MG-08 Maxson fired 7.92 57mm Mauser rounds. The British Vickers fired 303 British rounds. The French Hotchkiss fired 8mm Liebel rounds. The American M1917 fired 30.06 Springfield rounds. All of these were variations on the same basic theme. 7 to 8mm diameter projectiles weighing between 150 and 200 grains, fired at velocities between 2,400 and 2,800 feet per second, delivering between 2,500 and 3,600 foot-pounds of energy, depending on the specific cartridge and loading. These rounds were effective against infantry. Devastating against infantry, in fact. The casualty figures from battles like the Somme, Verdun, and Passchendaele demonstrated that machine gun fire could kill soldiers in numbers that were unprecedented in military history. But the battlefield was introducing 2 specific new threats that rifle-caliber weapons couldn't adequately address: aircraft and tanks. Aircraft were becoming a serious factor in combat. When the war began in August 1914, aircraft were unarmed reconnaissance platforms, observation planes that spotted enemy positions and directed artillery fire. The idea of aircraft as combat weapons barely existed, but war drives innovation at an accelerated pace, and by 1915, aircraft were being armed with machine guns and engaging in aerial combat. By 1916, specialized fighter aircraft were being developed specifically for air-to-air combat. By 1917, aircraft were dropping bombs on ground targets and strafing trenches with machine gun fire. Aircraft were a threat that required response. Ground forces needed the capability to defend themselves against aircraft attacks. But rifle-caliber machine guns, while they could hit aircraft if the aircraft flew low enough and slow enough, lacked the range and power to reliably bring down aircraft at the altitudes and speeds that were becoming standard. The problem was fundamentally one of ballistics and energy. A rifle-caliber bullet, fired vertically upward at maximum elevation, would reach an altitude of approximately 1,500 to 2,000 meters, depending on the specific cartridge and atmospheric conditions. But the bullet would be traveling very slowly at this maximum altitude, having expended most of its kinetic energy fighting gravity during ascent. A slow-moving bullet, even if it hit an aircraft, might not penetrate the aircraft's structure sufficiently to cause critical damage. The bullet might pass through fabric covering without hitting anything vital, might hit a wooden structural member but lack the energy to break it, might even hit the engine cowling but not penetrate deeply enough to damage critical engine components. Tanks had appeared on the battlefield, introducing a threat that existing infantry weapons couldn't counter. The British first used tanks at the Battle of the Somme in September 1916. These Mark I tanks were primitive machines by any standard, slow, moving at walking pace, mechanically unreliable, breaking down frequently, vulnerable to terrain, unable to cross wide trenches or operate effectively in mud. But they were immune to rifle fire. The armor plating that protected the crew and the vehicle's mechanical systems would stop rifle-caliber bullets completely. German infantry facing these early tanks found themselves essentially helpless. Their standard infantry rifles fired 7.92mm rounds that would ricochet off tank armor without penetrating. Their machine guns, firing the same ammunition, were equally ineffective. They could fire at the tanks all day without causing any damage whatsoever. The bullets would hit the armor plates and ricochet away, the impacts creating sparks but no penetration. The psychological effect of facing an armored vehicle that you couldn't damage with your weapons was significant. General John Joseph Pershing, commanding the American Expeditionary Forces in France, recognized these problems. American forces were arriving in Europe in increasing numbers throughout 1917 and into 1918. They would soon be entering combat in significant strength. They would face German machine gun positions. They would face aircraft attacks. They would potentially face German tanks if the Germans developed their own armored vehicles. And Pershing wanted American forces to have solutions to these emerging threats before they encountered them in combat. Pershing issued a requirement for a new machine gun. The specifications were precise and demanding. The weapon needed to fire a projectile at least half an inch in diameter, 50 caliber in American terminology, which was substantially larger than existing machine gun ammunition. The projectile needed to achieve a muzzle velocity exceeding 2,700 feet per second, which was faster than most existing machine gun rounds. The weapon needed to be capable of sustained automatic fire, delivering continuous firepower rather than single shots. The weapon needed to be reliable enough for military service, meaning it had to function under adverse conditions with minimal maintenance, and it needed to be capable of defeating both aircraft at altitude and light armor at combat ranges. These specifications represented a significant leap beyond existing machine gun technology. To put the requirement in context, the standard American machine gun at the time was the M1917, a Browning design firing .30-06 Springfield ammunition. This weapon fired a 150-grain projectile at approximately 2,800 feet per second, delivering roughly 2,600 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle. It was effective against infantry and could damage aircraft if it scored hits, but it lacked the energy to reliably defeat armor or guarantee that aircraft hits would result in kills. Pershing was asking for a weapon that would fire a projectile more than 4 times heavier than the M1917's projectile, weighing over 650 grains, at similar or even higher velocity. The energy required to accelerate such a massive projectile would be substantially greater than anything existing machine guns generated. The powder charge would need to be much larger. The chamber pressures would be much higher, requiring stronger materials and heavier construction throughout the weapon. The recoil forces would be dramatically larger, requiring a heavier weapon and a more robust recoil management system to remain controllable. The mechanical stresses on every component would be extreme, requiring careful engineering to ensure the weapon would function reliably rather than destroying itself during firing. This requirement was given to John Moses Browning. By 1917, Browning had an impressive record of successful firearms designs. He had designed the M1911 pistol, which had become the standard American military sidearm and would remain in service for over 70 years. He had designed the M1917 water-cooled machine gun, which was proving highly effective in combat in France. He had designed the Browning automatic rifle, which was just entering service as a light machine gun for infantry squads. If anyone could create a weapon meeting Pershing's challenging specifications, it was Browning. Browning's approach was characteristically methodical and based on sound engineering principles rather than speculation. He didn't attempt to create an entirely new operating system or mechanism from scratch, which would have been time-consuming and risky. Instead, he took his existing M1917 design, which was proven and reliable in combat, and scaled it up proportionally. The M1917 used a short recoil operating system, where the barrel and bolt were locked together and moved rearward during firing, then unlocked to allow the bolt to continue rearward while the barrel stopped. This system worked reliably. By maintaining the same basic geometry and proportions, while increasing the physical size of every component, Browning could ensure that the new weapon would have the same reliability characteristics as the proven. In 1917, every component was enlarged, proportionally to handle the increased forces and stresses from the much larger cartridge. The receiver, the main structural component that holds all the weapon's parts together, was made larger and substantially heavier to withstand the increased stresses. The bolt, which locks into the barrel and contains the cartridge during firing, was made larger and heavier. The barrel was manufactured with a larger bore diameter to accommodate the half-inch projectile, and the wall thickness was increased significantly to contain the much higher chamber pressures that the larger powder charge would generate. The recoil spring, which controls the bolt's rearward movement and then drives it forward again to chamber the next round, was made much stronger to handle the increased recoil forces. The feed mechanism was scaled up to handle the physically larger cartridges. The cartridge itself required careful development. Browning created what would become the 50 BMG cartridge. The BMG designation stood for Browning machine gun. The cartridge's metric designation is 12.7999 mm, indicating a 12.7 mm projectile diameter and a 99 mm case length. The cartridge was essentially a scaled-up .30-06 Springfield round. The case was larger in diameter and much longer, nearly 100 mm compared to the .30-06's 63 mm length, to hold substantially more propellant. The larger powder charge would generate the pressure needed to accelerate the heavy projectile to the required velocity. The case was rimless, meaning it had no rim projecting beyond the case body, which made feeding from belts smoother and more reliable. The design incorporated elements from the captured German 13.2 mm anti-tank rifle cartridge that American ordnance officers had studied. The result was a cartridge that fired a projectile, weighing between 650 and 700 grains, depending on the specific projectile type, at muzzle velocities approaching 3,000 feet per second from longer barrels. From the typical 45-inch barrel of the machine gun configuration, velocities of 2,800 to 2,900 feet per second were achieved. The energy delivered was approximately 13,000 to 14,000 foot-pounds, depending on the specific projectile, weight and velocity achieved. Let me explain what those numbers mean in practical terms by comparing them to existing weapons and explaining the physics of projectile energy. The German .57 Mauser rifle round, standard German infantry ammunition throughout both world wars, fired a 198-grain projectile at 2,575 feet per second. Using the kinetic energy formula, where energy equals 1/2 times mass times velocity squared, this delivered approximately 3,600 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle. This was sufficient to kill a human being at considerable range, could penetrate several inches of wood or similar soft materials, could defeat thin sheet metal, but couldn't penetrate armor plate of any significant thickness. The British .303 cartridge delivered roughly 3,200 foot-pounds. The French 8mm Liebel delivered approximately 2,800 foot-pounds. The American .30-06 delivered about 2,600 foot-pounds. All of these were in the same general range, between 2,500 and 3,600 foot-pounds. The 50 BMG delivered between 13,000 and 14,000 foot-pounds of energy. This was roughly 4 times the energy of a rifle round. This wasn't a modest improvement or an incremental advance in capability. This was a fundamental shift to a different category of weapon effect. The energy was sufficient to defeat armor plate that would stop rifle rounds with ease. was sufficient to penetrate multiple walls of substantial buildings, was sufficient to cause catastrophic structural damage to aircraft, was sufficient to guarantee that hits on personnel would be immediately fatal. But energy alone doesn't tell the complete story of the weapon's effects. The effect of a projectile depends on how that energy is transferred to the target. A small, fast projectile might pass through soft target material without transferring much energy, creating a relatively small wound channel despite high energy levels. A larger projectile with the same energy will transfer more energy to the target because its larger diameter creates more resistance as it passes through material. The 50 BMG projectile was half an inch in diameter compared to roughly 0.3 inches for a rifle bullet. This larger diameter, combined with the extreme energy, meant the projectile would create both a permanent cavity and a much larger temporary cavity when passing through soft materials like human tissue. The first prototype emerged in late 1918 and entered limited production as the M1921. It was water-cooled, like the M1917 it was based on. A water jacket surrounded the barrel, and water circulated through this jacket to carry away the heat generated by sustained firing. The weapon weighed approximately 84 pounds without water. The water to fill the cooling jacket added another 36 pounds. The tripod mount added another 44 pounds. A complete system weighed approximately 165 pounds plus ammunition. Each 50 BMG cartridge weighed nearly 4 ounces, so even a modest ammunition supply of 200 rounds would add another 50 pounds. The weapon was primarily intended for anti-aircraft use. It would be mounted on fixed positions for coastal defense or on ships for defense against aircraft attacks. But initial testing revealed limitations. The weapon was too heavy for infantry to carry and deploy. Even breaking it down into components, multiple soldiers would be needed to transport the weapon, the mount, and sufficient ammunition over any significant distance. Aircraft of the early 1920s couldn't accommodate the weapon's weight and size. Vehicle mounting was problematic because the weapon could only be fed ammunition from the left side. The M1921 seemed destined to remain a specialized weapon with limited applications. But development continued after World War I ended. John Browning died in 1926 while visiting the Fabrique Nationale factory in Belgium. But engineers at Colt and at the Army's Springfield Armory continued refining his design. The breakthrough came with a series of incremental improvements. The feeding mechanism was redesigned so the weapon could accept ammunition from either the left or right side by simply changing the top cover and moving a few internal components. This made vehicle mounting much more practical. A universal receiver was developed that could accept different barrel configurations: water-cooled barrels with cooling jackets for sustained fire, heavy air-cooled barrels for ground use, or light, air-cooled barrels for aircraft mounting where weight was critical. This modular design was revolutionary for its time. Instead of requiring completely different weapons for different roles, a single receiver could be configured for any application by changing the barrel and a few other components. This simplified logistics enormously. Spare parts could be shared between different configurations. Training was simplified because the basic operation was identical regardless of configuration. Manufacturing was simplified because the receiver was the same for all versions. The improved weapon was designated M2 Browning machine gun in 1933. The timing was significant. The early 1930s saw rising international tensions. Japan had invaded Manchuria in 1931. Nazi Germany was secretly rearming in violation of the Versailles Treaty. Italy was becoming increasingly aggressive in Africa. War seemed increasingly likely. During this period, other nations were developing 20mm and 30mm autocannons for anti-aircraft and anti-armor use. These weapons fired explosive projectiles that would detonate on impact. The American military considered whether to develop similar autocannon systems, but the decision was made to standardize the M2 instead. The M2 was lighter than autocannons. It had a higher rate of fire. The 50 BMG cartridge, while smaller than 20mm rounds, was faster and more accurate at range, and critically, The M2 was ready for immediate production, while autocannons would require years of development. By the time World War II began in September 1939, the United States had substantial numbers of M2 machine guns in inventory. The weapon was mounted on coast artillery installations, was being installed on new Navy ships, was mounted on tanks and armored vehicles, was available for infantry units in the heavy weapons role. But the weapon's full potential wouldn't be realized until American forces entered large-scale combat. The M2's versatility became its greatest strength. On aircraft, it used a lightweight barrel and was tuned to fire between 750 and 1,200 rounds per minute for short engagements where brief firing windows required maximum rounds on target. On effect, ground mounts in vehicles, it used a heavy barrel and fired at 450 to 575 rounds per minute, allowing sustained fire for longer periods without barrel overheating. American aircraft would carry extraordinary numbers of M2 machine guns. The B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bomber, in its G model, mounted 13 M2 machine guns in various turrets and positions, providing defensive fire in every direction. 2 in the chin turret, 2 in the dorsal turret, 2 in the ball turret, 2 in the waist positions, 2 in the tail turret, 1 in the radio operator's position, 1 each in the cheek positions. German fighters attacking from any angle would face multiple 50 caliber machine guns. The B-24 Liberator heavy bomber carried 10 M2s. American fighter aircraft used M2s as their primary armament. The P-47 Thunderbolt carried 8 M2 machine guns, 4 in each wing. The P-51 Mustang carried 6 M2s. The P-38 Lightning carried 1 20mm cannon and 4 M2s. The concentrated firepower of multiple 50s gave American fighters devastating capability against enemy aircraft. Every American tank mounted at least 1 M2. The Sherman tank had an M2 on a pintle mount on the turret roof, operated by the tank commander. Some Sherman variants had additional M2s. Tank destroyers like the M10 and M36 mounted M2s. Armored cars like the M8 Greyhound mounted M2s. Half-tracks and armored personnel carriers mounted M2s. Self-propelled artillery pieces mounted M2s for local defense against aircraft and ground targets. Jeeps, the ubiquitous light utility vehicle that became symbolic of American mobility, were fitted with pintle mounts for M2s. A Jeep with an M2 mounted became a mobile fire support platform, providing heavy firepower that could suppress enemy positions or engage light vehicles. By 1945, the United States had produced millions of M2 machine guns. Estimates range from 2 million to over 3 million weapons produced during the war years, making it by far the most produced heavy machine gun in history. For German forces, this ubiquity created a tactical problem that was essentially unsolvable. No matter what you attacked, no matter where you attacked, no matter what time of day or what weather conditions, you faced 50 caliber fire. Attack an American infantry position, there would be M2s in the defensive line. Attack an American vehicle column, every vehicle would have an M2 mounted. Attack American aircraft in the air, they would defend themselves with M2s. Launch aircraft attacks against American ground forces, anti-aircraft M2 fire would meet you. The weapon was everywhere, all the time, in every sector of every front. Let me explain why this created such fear among German troops by examining the specific effects of 50 BMG ammunition on different types of targets. The standard ball round, a full metal jacket projectile weighing approximately 700 grains, carried sufficient energy to penetrate multiple walls of a typical European building. Buildings in France, Belgium, and Germany were typically constructed of brick or stone masonry, with walls that might be 12 to 18 inches thick. These walls would stop rifle fire easily. A German Mauser round hitting a brick wall would penetrate perhaps 3 to 4 inches and stop, its energy expended in fragmenting brick and creating a crater in the wall surface. The 50 BMG ball round would penetrate the first wall completely, creating an entry hole approximately 3 inches in diameter due to brick fragmentation. The round would pass through the interior of the building, through any interior walls in its path, and it would exit through a wall on the opposite side of the structure, creating a similar exit hole. In some cases, depending on wall thickness and the specific construction, a single round would penetrate 3 or even 4 walls before finally being stopped. German forces learned this lesson quickly and painfully during urban combat operations. Taking cover inside a building, which should have provided excellent protection, provided no protection at all from M2 fire. The rounds would find you regardless of how deep inside the structure you positioned yourself. Soldiers who thought they were safe because they were inside a substantial building, away from windows, behind multiple walls, discovered that 50 caliber fire didn't care about walls. American doctrine evolved specifically to exploit this capability. When encountering a fortified building occupied by German defenders, American forces would bring up M2-equipped vehicles, typically Sherman tanks with their turret-mounted 50s or half-tracks with pintle-mounted weapons. The M2 gunners would methodically work over the structure with sustained fire, putting hundreds of rounds through the walls. They would systematically cover the entire structure, firing into every section where defenders might be positioned. The effect on German defenders was devastating, both physically and psychologically. The walls would shake from the impacts. Each round striking the exterior wall would send a shockwave through the structure. Dust and stone fragments would fill the interior air, making it difficult to see or breathe. The noise was overwhelming, the impacts creating a continuous thunder that made communication impossible and coherent thought difficult. And rounds would penetrate unpredictably, killing soldiers who thought they were in safe positions away from the exterior walls. Armor-piercing rounds could penetrate approximately 1 inch, or 25 millimeters, of hardened steel plate at point-blank range. At 500 meters, penetration was still over 20 millimeters. At 1,000 meters, penetration decreased to approximately 15 millimeters, but was still sufficient to defeat most light armor employed by any combatant nation. This meant the M2 could defeat the armor of nearly every German armored car and half-track in service. The SDKFZ-222 four-wheeled armored car, used extensively for reconnaissance, had armor protection ranging from 8 millimeters on the sides and rear to 14.5 millimeters on the frontal arc. The 50 BMG armor-piercing round could penetrate this armor at any combat range and from any angle. The vehicle's speed, up to 80 kilometers per hour on roads, which normally allowed it to escape from dangerous situations, was irrelevant if the vehicle was already under accurate fire, before the crew realized they were in danger. The SDKFZ-251 half-track, the standard German armored personnel carrier that transported infantry into combat, had armor protection ranging from 6 mm to 14.5 mm depending on location. The front armor was 14.5 mm, the sides were 8 mm, the rear was 6 mm. All of this armor was vulnerable to 50 caliber armor-piercing fire at any practical combat range. A half-track carrying a squad of infantry would be penetrated, the round passing through the armor, through the interior where the infantry was seated, and potentially through the armor on the opposite side. The infantry inside, who thought they were protected by the vehicle's armor, would be killed by the round passing through the interior, or by fragments of armor knocked loose by the impact. Even tank armor was vulnerable from the sides or rear, where armor thickness was reduced to save weight. German tanks like the Panzer IV had front armor of 80 millimeters, which the 50 BMG couldn't penetrate except at point-blank range under ideal conditions. But the side armor was only 30 meters, and the rear armor was 20 meters. At close ranges, particularly at ranges under 300 meters, 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds could penetrate these thinner armor plates. Tank commanders learned to fear American defensive positions that included M2s, because if their tank was caught in a position where its side or rear was exposed, a skilled M2 gunner could disable or destroy it. Moreover, tanks had vulnerable points regardless of overall armor thickness. Vision ports, the small openings with armored glass that allowed the crew to see outside, were potential entry points for 50 caliber rounds. Hitting a vision port was extremely difficult, requiring a skilled gunner and favorable conditions, but it was possible. If a round penetrated a vision port, it would enter the tank's interior with lethal consequences for the crew. Track components, the wheels and tracks that allowed the tank to move, were vulnerable to 50 caliber fire. A round striking a track could break it, immobilizing the tank and making it a stationary target. Engine components, visible from the rear of the tank through engine deck grating, were vulnerable. Multiple hits to the engine could disable it, permanently stopping the tank even if the crew survived. Incendiary rounds were designed to ignite flammable materials on impact. The projectile contained a mixture of phosphorus or similar incendiary compounds in a cavity within the projectile. When the projectile struck a target and was suddenly decelerated, the impact would trigger the incendiary compound to ignite and scatter, spreading fire over the impact area. When fired at aircraft, these rounds were devastating. Aircraft of World War II, both Allied and Axis, carried large quantities of aviation gasoline. This high-octane fuel was extremely flammable. The fuel was stored in tanks inside the wings or fuselage, sometimes protected by self-sealing systems that were designed to close small holes automatically to prevent fuel leakage. But a 50 caliber incendiary round could penetrate the fuel tank structure and ignite the fuel inside with catastrophic results. An aircraft with a burning fuel tank would often suffer complete structural failure within seconds. The fire would spread rapidly through the fuel system. The heat would weaken aluminum structural components. The fuel system would fail, causing the engine to stop. Control cables might burn through, making the aircraft uncontrollable. The aircraft would enter an uncontrollable dive or spin and crash. German pilots reported that aircraft hit by 50 caliber incendiary rounds rarely made it back to base. The fire would force the crew to bail out immediately, or the fire would destroy the aircraft's structural integrity before it could land. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds combined both capabilities in a single projectile. The projectile had a hardened steel or tungsten carbide core for armor penetration, and an incendiary compound that would ignite after penetration. This round was particularly effective against aircraft because it would penetrate the aircraft's aluminum skin, then ignite fuel or hydraulic fluid or other flammable materials inside the aircraft. It was also effective against vehicles, where penetrating the armor and then igniting fuel or ammunition inside would guarantee destruction of the vehicle and death of the crew. Tracer rounds, typically loaded as every fifth round in an ammunition belt, contained a pyrotechnic composition in the base of the projectile that burned brightly during flight, creating a visible streak of light that marked the trajectory. This allowed gunners to observe where their fire was going and adjust their aim in real time. If tracers were falling short of the target, the gunner could elevate the weapon slightly. If tracers were passing over the target, the gunner could depress the weapon. This real-time visual feedback made it much easier to engage targets at long range where the time of flight was significant. The M2's effective range exceeded 2,000 meters against point targets and could reach even farther against area targets like troop concentrations or vehicle columns. This range substantially exceeded the effective range of German rifle-caliber machine guns. The MG-42, feared by Allied forces for its extremely high rate of fire, of up to 1,200 rounds per minute, had an effective range of approximately 1,000 meters against point targets. Beyond that range, the small 7.92-meter projectiles lost velocity and energy rapidly, and hitting targets became a matter of firing many rounds and hoping some would connect, rather than being able to aim precisely. The 50 caliber could engage targets at twice the MG-42's effective range. This range differential created tactical situations where German forces were under effective fire, but couldn't effectively return fire. They were in what military doctrine calls a beaten zone, the area where projectiles are landing, but their own weapons couldn't reach the source of the fire. German infantry would be taking casualties from M2 positions that were beyond the range, where their rifles and machine guns could hit back. The only tactical responses were to withdraw out of range, which meant giving up ground and objectives. Call for artillery support to destroy the M2 position with indirect fire. Call for tanks to engage the M2 position with direct fire from their main guns, or attempt to close the range while under fire, advancing across open ground while being engaged by a weapon that didn't miss often and didn't wound, only killed. Closing the range while under sustained 50 caliber fire was usually fatal. German training emphasized fire and maneuver tactics where infantry would advance by bounds, some soldiers providing covering fire while others moved forward to new positions. Against positions defended by rifle-caliber weapons, these tactics were effective. Against positions defended by M2s, these tactics resulted in catastrophic casualties. The advancing soldiers would be exposed during movement, and exposure to 50 caliber fire meant death. Units attempting to close with M2 positions would typically suffer 30 to 50% casualties before breaking contact and withdrawing. These casualty rates made such attacks operationally unsustainable. Let me provide specific examples of M2 effectiveness from different theaters and different tactical situations to illustrate how the weapon shaped combat across all fronts where American forces operated. In North Africa, where American forces first encountered German and Italian forces in large-scale combat operations, the M2 proved its tactical value quickly and decisively. German forces in North Africa relied heavily on armored reconnaissance units for intelligence gathering and screening operations. These units, equipped with SDKFZ 222 and 2N23 four-wheeled armored cars, would range ahead of the main force, identifying enemy positions, probing for weaknesses in defensive lines, reporting on enemy strength and dispositions to higher headquarters. The SDKFZ 222 was an effective reconnaissance vehicle under normal circumstances. Its speed allowed it to escape from dangerous situations. Its radio allowed it to report intelligence in real time. Its light armament, typically a 20mm autocannon, allowed it to engage light targets. Its thin armor was sufficient to protect the crew from rifle fire and shell fragments. But when these vehicles encountered American defensive positions that included M2s, every advantage became irrelevant. American defensive doctrine in North Africa emphasized establishing strong points at key terrain features and road junctions. These strong points would typically include infantry, anti-tank guns, and at least one M2 heavy machine gun positioned to cover likely approach routes. The M2 gunner would scan the desert approaches with binoculars, watching for enemy movement. When a German armored car appeared, moving at speed across the desert terrain, the M2 gunner would track it and engage at ranges of 1,000 meters or more. At these ranges, the German vehicle couldn't effectively return fire. The 20mm autocannon had a maximum effective range of approximately 600 meters. The armored car would be under fire for 15 to 20 seconds before it could close to a range where it could shoot back. And in those 15 to 20 seconds, the M2 gunner would fire multiple bursts, putting dozens of 50 caliber rounds toward the target. German after-action reports from North Africa document numerous engagements where armored cars were destroyed or disabled at long range by M2 fire. The armor-piercing rounds would penetrate the thin armor from any angle. The vehicle would often catch fire as fuel tanks were hit. The crew would be killed by the rounds penetrating the fighting compartment. In many cases, the first indication the German crew had that they were under fire was the impact of rounds hitting their vehicle. And seconds later, the vehicle was burning, and the crew was dead. German reconnaissance effectiveness in North Africa declined substantially in sectors where American forces operated. Reconnaissance commanders began refusing to send patrols into areas where M2s were reported or suspected. This meant German higher headquarters had degraded intelligence about American positions, dispositions, and intentions, couldn't accurately determine American strength in various sectors, couldn't identify weak points in American defensive lines that might be exploited. The intelligence failure contributed directly to tactical and operational failures. German attacks would be launched based on incomplete or inaccurate intelligence, leading to costly failures when the actual situation differed from what commanders expected. In Italy, where the terrain was mountainous and the fighting often occurred in towns and villages built of stone, the M2's ability to defeat masonry structures became tactically decisive. Italian villages, many of them centuries old, featured substantial stone buildings with walls 2 or 3 feet thick. These buildings provided excellent defensive positions. German forces would occupy villages, fortify the buildings, and use them as strong points to control key roads and mountain passes. American forces advancing through Italy would encounter these fortified villages and would need to reduce them to continue the advance. Traditional tactics called for surrounding the village, calling for artillery fire to destroy the buildings and kill or suppress the defenders, then assaulting with infantry once the defenders were weakened. But artillery ammunition was often in short supply, and artillery fire wasn't always available when needed. The M2 provided an alternative approach. American commanders would position M2-equipped vehicles, typically Sherman tanks or M10 tank destroyers, at ranges of 500 to 800 meters from the village. The M2 gunners would engage the stone buildings with sustained fire, methodically working over each structure. The 50 caliber rounds would punch through the stone walls. Rounds would enter through windows and firing ports. The combination of rounds penetrating walls and rounds entering through openings meant that defenders had no safe positions inside the buildings. German defenders reported that the psychological effect of being inside a stone building under M2 fire was overwhelming. The impacts shook the entire structure. Each round hitting the wall sent a shock wave through the building that could be felt throughout. Stone fragments and dust filled the interior. Visibility inside became almost zero. The noise was deafening, making communication impossible. Soldiers couldn't hear orders, couldn't coordinate with each other, and at random intervals rounds would penetrate completely, killing soldiers who were nowhere near windows or exterior walls. After 10 or 15 minutes of sustained M2 fire on a building, German defenders would typically attempt to withdraw if they had an escape route. Morale would collapse under the sustained hammering. Soldiers would refuse to stay in positions where they felt helpless and where death seemed certain. Buildings that German forces could have defended for hours or days against conventional infantry and light weapons would be abandoned after minutes of M2 fire. American infantry would then assault the village, often finding it partially or completely evacuated. In France, after the Normandy landings, the M2's effectiveness from aircraft became a dominant factor in German tactical planning. The Allied air forces had achieved air superiority over France by July 1944. German aircraft rarely appeared over the battlefield. American fighter bombers operated with near impunity, attacking German ground forces whenever weather permitted flying. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its 8 M2 machine guns and ability to carry bombs and rockets, became the most feared American aircraft among German ground forces. A flight of 4 P-47s carried 32 50 caliber machine guns between them. When these aircraft found a German vehicle column moving on a road, they would attack in sequence, diving from altitude and firing their guns while diving toward the target. A single P-47 making a strafing run would fire approximately 640 rounds in a 2-second burst, all 8 guns firing simultaneously. The density of fire was so high that hitting vehicles was nearly guaranteed even without perfect aim. A German truck or half-track on the road would be struck by dozens of rounds in a fraction of a second. The vehicle would be destroyed, would catch fire. The soldiers inside would be killed by the rounds penetrating the vehicle or by fragments and shrapnel. Even soldiers who survived the initial strike would often be caught by subsequent aircraft in the flight, making their own strafing runs. German mechanized units learned to move only during darkness or in fog and cloud cover, when American aircraft couldn't operate. Movement during daylight and clear weather was suicidal. This restriction on movement had cascading effects on German operational capabilities. Units couldn't reposition quickly to respond to American attacks, couldn't concentrate forces for counterattacks, couldn't move supplies forward efficiently. The cumulative effect was that German forces became much less mobile and much less capable of conducting the mobile defense that might have been effective against American advances. Let me describe in detail what happened when 50 BMG projectiles hit human targets, because understanding the wound ballistics is essential to understanding the fear that German soldiers developed toward this weapon. This will necessarily be graphic, but it's important to understand the physical reality. The human body, for purposes of understanding wound ballistics, consists primarily of water and soft tissue, with a skeletal structure providing rigidity and shape. Approximately 60 to 70% of body weight is water. The internal organs are soft tissue with very high water content. The bones provide structural support, but represent a relatively small portion of total body mass. When a high-velocity projectile enters the body, it creates several distinct types of tissue damage. First is the permanent wound cavity, which is the actual physical hole created by the projectile as it passes through tissue. This cavity is roughly the diameter of the projectile itself, perhaps slightly larger if the projectile tumbles during its passage through tissue, or if it deforms on impact. Second is the temporary wound cavity, created by the shock wave that radiates outward from the projectile's path. As the projectile passes through tissue at high velocity, it transfers kinetic energy to the tissue. This energy transfer causes tissue to be displaced violently outward from the projectile's path, creating a large cavity that exists for only a few milliseconds before collapsing. But during the brief time this cavity exists, it stretches and tears tissue far from the actual path of the projectile. Blood vessels are ruptured. Organs are damaged by the stretching forces. Bones can be fractured by the shock wave, even if the projectile doesn't directly strike them. For a rifle-caliber round like the German 7.92 mm, Mauser firing a 198-grain projectile at 2,575 feet per second, the temporary cavity in human tissue is approximately 60 to 100 millimeters in diameter at its maximum point, roughly 2 to 4 inches. This is significant. A hit to the torso will damage not just the tissue directly in the projectile's path, but also tissue several inches to either side. But the damage is somewhat localized. If the projectile passes through the chest but doesn't hit the heart or a major blood vessel, the victim might survive with prompt medical treatment. The wound is serious but potentially survivable, depending on exactly what organs were damaged and how quickly treatment is provided. For the 50 BMG projectile, firing a 700-grain projectile at 2,800 feet per second, wound ballistic studies conducted during World War II and in subsequent decades showed that the temporary cavity in human tissue exceeded 300 millimeters in diameter, over 12 inches. This wasn't a small wound cavity that damaged tissue close to the projectile's path. This was a massive cavity that encompassed the entire width of the human torso. The practical effect was clear and unambiguous. Any hit to the torso was immediately fatal. Not likely fatal or probably fatal, certain to be fatal. The temporary cavity was so large that the heart would be destroyed by the shock wave, even if the projectile passed to one side of it. The lungs would be destroyed. The liver would be destroyed. The major blood vessels, particularly the aorta and vena cava, which are the main arteries and veins, would be ruptured. There was no such thing as a through-and-through wound that somehow missed all vital organs. The physics didn't allow for it. The size of the temporary cavity meant that all vital organs in the torso were within the affected zone, regardless of where exactly the projectile entered. Extremity hits would sever limbs completely. An arm or leg hit by a .50 caliber projectile would be torn off at the shoulder or hip. Not broken, not partially severed requiring amputation. Completely torn off by the energy transfer. German medics reported collecting what remained of casualties and finding limbs simply missing, separated from the body and lying meters away from the rest of the remains. This created a psychological effect that went beyond normal combat fear. Soldiers in combat learned to deal with the possibility of death. They develop psychological mechanisms for coping with danger. They focus on their training, on their mission, on their comrades. They tell themselves they'll be the ones who survive. They accept that they might be wounded but convince themselves that if they're wounded, they'll be evacuated and treated and they'll recover. But facing a weapon that didn't wound, that killed instantly and completely, that left no possibility of survival or medical treatment, created a different kind of fear. German soldiers couldn't tell themselves they might be wounded but survive. The mathematics and physics didn't allow for that possibility. A hit meant death. Instant, certain, complete death. And everyone who had witnessed .50 caliber hits knew this. The knowledge spread through units. Veterans would warn new soldiers. The fear became part of German tactical thinking. German tactical manuals from 1944 and 1945 specifically addressed how to approach American positions defended by heavy machine guns. These manuals, based on combat experience and after-action reports from multiple theaters, provided guidance that explicitly acknowledged the tactical challenge the M2 presented. The guidance was, avoid direct approaches if possible. Use smoke for concealment if direct approach is necessary. Engage M2 positions with indirect fire from mortars or artillery before attempting infantry assault. Use tanks or tank destroyers to destroy M2 positions with direct fire from standoff range. Use snipers to eliminate M2 gunners before they can engage your forces. Under no circumstances attempt to assault positions with active 50 caliber fire without effective suppression. The phrase, "under no circumstances," is significant. German tactical doctrine throughout the war had emphasized offensive action and aggressive assault tactics. German training emphasized closing with the enemy, using fire and maneuver to overcome defensive positions. The fact that late war manuals were explicitly telling soldiers not to assault certain positions represents an acknowledgement that traditional aggressive tactics didn't work against M2s. This represented a fundamental change in German tactical thinking, driven by combat experience with a weapon they had no equivalent for, and no effective counter to. The Quad 50 mount, designated M45 Maxson, deserves special attention because this system multiplied the M2's already formidable effects exponentially and became perhaps the single most feared weapon system in the entire American arsenal from the German perspective. The Quad 50 mounted 4 M2 machine guns on a single electrically powered rotating turret. The mount could traverse a full 360 degrees and elevate to 90 degrees, providing coverage in all directions, including straight up for anti-aircraft work. The 4 machine guns were synchronized to fire together, providing a combined rate of fire exceeding 2,000 rounds per minute. That translates to approximately 34 rounds per second, striking the target area. The system was originally developed for anti-aircraft use, providing high-volume fire against low-flying aircraft. Against aircraft, the Quad 50 was extraordinarily effective. 4 M2s firing simultaneously meant that approximately 136 rounds were in the air every second. The density of fire created what pilots described as a wall of lead that aircraft had to fly through. The probability that an aircraft flying through this cone of fire would be hit by multiple rounds approached certainty. German and Italian pilots reported that positions defended by Quad 50s were essentially unattackable by low-flying aircraft. Aircraft attempting to attack such positions would be destroyed with near certainty, but American forces discovered that the Quad 50's effectiveness against ground targets exceeded its effectiveness against aircraft. When 450 caliber machine guns fired simultaneously at a single point target like a building or a vehicle, the combined effect was comparable to artillery fire in terms of destructive capability. A 2-second burst from a Quad 50 would put over 60 rounds onto the target. Buildings would be reduced to rubble within seconds. Stone walls would disintegrate. Vehicles would be shredded, torn apart by the concentration of fire. Infantry caught in the open would be annihilated, literally torn to pieces by the density of projectiles. American forces began using Quad 50s for direct fire support during infantry assaults. When attacking fortified positions, the Quad 50 would be positioned at a standoff range, typically 800 to 1,200 meters from the target. As American infantry advanced, the Quad 50 would engage any German defensive positions that opened fire or revealed themselves. The concentrated firepower of 4 M2s firing together meant that defensive positions could be suppressed completely or destroyed outright within seconds of being identified. German defenders who survived Quad 50 fire reported being unable to function coherently during the engagement. The sound was a continuous roar that made communication impossible and made coherent thought difficult. The visual experience of seeing the impacts, dust and debris filling the air, structures disintegrating, was overwhelming. The physical impact of near misses, the concussion from rounds impacting nearby, created physical shock. December 17, 1944. Klaus Zimmermann survived that morning in the Ardennes Forest. His company continued its advance for another 2 hours before being forced to withdraw by American counterattacks. Zimmermann was captured by American forces on January 18, 1945, during the fighting around Houffalize, as German forces retreated from the Bulge salient. He spent the remainder of the war in a prisoner of war camp in France, then in a labor camp in France for 2 years after Germany's surrender, as French authorities used German prisoners for reconstruction work. He was finally released and repatriated to Germany in 1947. returning to find his hometown of Cologne substantially destroyed by Allied bombing raids. He worked in the construction industry for the next 40 years, helping rebuild Germany's shattered infrastructure. He married in 1950. He had 2 children and 4 grandchildren. By all accounts, he lived a normal, productive life in post-war West Germany. He rarely spoke about his war experiences except to other veterans who had shared similar experiences and would understand. In 1993, a German military historian researching the Battle of the Bulge from the German perspective contacted Zimmermann and requested an interview. Zimmermann, then 71 years old, agreed to the interview. The transcript is preserved in the archives of the German Federal Military History Research Office. When the historian asked what American weapon Zimmermann had feared most during his combat service, Zimmermann's answer was immediate. The .50 caliber machine gun, he said. We called it the Fleischwolf, the meat grinder. You could hear it from a kilometer away, that deep, slow hammering sound. Once you heard that sound, you knew someone was dying. Maybe it would be you. Maybe it would be the man next to you. But someone was dying. The sound meant death with absolute certainty. The historian asked why the .50 caliber was more frightening than other weapons. After all, artillery killed far more soldiers. Tank main guns were more destructive. Why single out the .50 caliber? Zimmermann's response was matter-of-fact and precise, the words of a man who had thought about this question many times over the decades. You could survive other weapons. Artillery. You heard the shells incoming and you took cover. And you hoped the shell didn't land directly on you. Most shells didn't hit anyone. They exploded and threw shrapnel, and if you were in cover, you usually survived. Small arms fire, rifles, and normal machine guns. You kept your head down and your chances were decent. The bullets were small. Cover worked. You could take cover behind walls or trees or even in small depressions in the ground, and the bullets wouldn't hit you. He continued. The .50 caliber, there was no surviving it. If you were hit, you were dead. Not wounded. Dead. Not, maybe you'll die without medical treatment. Dead instantly. We knew this because we'd all seen what happened when someone was hit by .50 caliber fire. Bodies came apart. So when you heard that sound, you knew that whoever was in the gunner's sights was already dead. They just didn't know it yet. They might be moving, might be taking cover, might think they had a chance, but if the gunner could see them and decided to fire, they were dead. The mathematics of it were certain. This interview, preserved in the German military archives and cited in numerous subsequent historical works, captures the psychological reality that German soldiers experienced when facing M2 fire. The weapon's lethality in pure statistical terms was high, but not the highest. But its psychological impact was extraordinary. German soldiers knew, with certainty based on direct observation and experience, that exposure to .50 caliber fire meant death. This knowledge affected every tactical decision, every movement, every choice about whether to advance or withdraw. The M2 Browning has now been in continuous military service for 91 years. It was standardized in 1933. It is now 2024. In the entire history of military firearms, very few weapons can claim even half this longevity. Most weapons are obsolete within a generation, replaced by newer designs that incorporate technological improvements or that address deficiencies identified in combat use. But the M2 remains in frontline service across dozens of militaries worldwide, including the United States military that originally developed it. The most recent modification, designated M2A1, was introduced in the 2000s. This variant added a quick-change barrel system to simplify barrel replacement during sustained fire operations. The original M2 required tools and a specific procedure to change barrels, and the process took several minutes. The M2A1 barrel can be changed without tools in under a minute. The M2A1 also added a flash suppressor to reduce the gunner's visual signature during night operations, making it harder for enemy forces to locate the weapon by observing muzzle flash. And the M2A1 incorporated a manual safety mechanism, allowing the weapon to be placed in a safe condition when not in immediate use. These modifications represent incremental improvements to enhance usability and safety. They don't change the fundamental operating system. The receiver design is unchanged from 1933. The bolt, barrel, recoil spring, All the core components that make the weapon function remain essentially identical to the original 1933 specification. A gunner trained on an M2 in 1945 could operate an M2A1 in 2024 without retraining. The weapon Klaus Zimmermann faced in 1944 and the weapon in service today are, at their core, the same weapon. This longevity is remarkable when considered in the context of the extraordinary technological changes that have occurred since 1933. In that 91-year span, we've progressed from fabric-covered biplane fighters to stealth jets with supersonic speeds, from tanks with riveted armor and short-barreled guns to modern main battle tanks with composite armor and guided munitions, from bolt-action rifles requiring manual operation between shots to assault rifles with 30-round magazines, optical sights, and select fire capability. Nearly every weapon system that existed in 1933 has been replaced by fundamentally different designs, often replaced multiple times as technology advanced. But the M2 remains. Defense analysts and military planners project that the M2 will remain in active frontline service beyond 2050, which would represent over 120 years of continuous use with the same basic design. No other weapon in history can claim such longevity, while remaining tactically relevant and effective against modern threats. Why has the M2 endured when everything else changed? Several factors explain this extraordinary longevity. First, the 50 BMG cartridge hit an optimal point in the balance between effectiveness and practical considerations like weight and cost. Smaller calibers lack sufficient destructive effect against certain targets, particularly light armored vehicles and aircraft. Larger calibers, like 20mm or 30mm, are more effective per hit, but the weapons become much heavier. The ammunition becomes much heavier and more expensive, and the rate of fire typically decreases. The 50 BMG provides devastating effect against a very wide range of targets, while the ammunition remains light enough that substantial quantities can be carried and stored, and inexpensive enough that it can be used in large quantities during training and combat. Second, the short recoil operating system that Browning designed was so fundamentally sound and robust that it has required essentially no modification in 9 decades. The mechanism works reliably under all environmental conditions, from Arctic cold to desert heat, from humidity to dust. It works with minimal maintenance and lubrication. It works when the weapon is dirty. This reliability is far more important in practical military use than theoretical performance advantages that a less reliable system might offer. Soldiers trust weapons that work every time. The M2 works every time. Third, the weapon's versatility means it effectively fills multiple roles across multiple branches of service: anti-vehicle, anti-aircraft, anti-materiel against bunkers and fortifications, long-range precision fire, close-range suppression. The same basic weapon serves all these roles simply by changing the barrel configuration and mounting system. A military can standardize on the M2 and have confidence that the weapon will be effective, regardless of what tactical situation is encountered. A replacement weapon would need to match this incredible versatility, which has proven difficult. Fourth, the logistics and support infrastructure exists and is mature. Spare parts are manufactured by multiple companies in multiple countries and are readily available. Military armorers are trained in M2 maintenance and repair, and that training is standardized and well established. Ammunition is produced in enormous quantities, currently estimated at hundreds of millions of rounds per year globally. The entire support system exists to keep M2s operational indefinitely. Replacing the M2 would require not just developing a new weapon that performs better, but building an entirely new global logistics and support infrastructure from the ground up. The institutional inertia favoring retention of the existing weapon is enormous. That is the story of the M2 Browning Meadeus 50 caliber machine gun. The story of why German soldiers feared it more than almost any other American weapon. Why it was tactically effective far beyond what its technical specifications might suggest. And why, over 90 years after its introduction, and 80 years after Klaus Zimmermann faced its fire in the Ardennes Forest, it remains the global standard by which all other heavy machine guns are measured. The thunder of the M2's fire, that deep hammering sound that Klaus Zimmermann heard on a frozen December morning in Belgium, continues to echo across battlefields worldwide today. And soldiers who face that fire understand, just as German soldiers understood 80 years ago, that they are facing something exceptional, something that represents the perfect intersection of engineering design, physical principles, and tactical application, something that kills with mathematical certainty. The dark reason Germans feared and hated the American M250 caliber machine gun was not emotional hatred based on propaganda or irrational fear. It was a rational fear and grudging respect, born from direct experience with a weapon that was simply, objectively, devastatingly effective. A weapon that reduced combat to mathematics and physics, and the mathematics always favored the weapon. A weapon that meant death with certainty rather than probability, and that certainty was more psychologically powerful than the more dangerous but less certain threats they faced throughout 6 years of war.